Welcome to Module 3. Right now we're going to be focusing on comprehension. The Rand Reading Study Group defined reading comprehension as the process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. So let's think about what it means to make meaning. When good readers read, their minds are incredibly active. As they go through a text, they are constantly thinking about what they are reading currently, what they've read before, and creating understandings that are flexible and are able to adapt to new information as it comes. Less skilled readers, on the other hand, tend to keep reading in a strict decoding space. They see successful reading as translating letters into sounds to make words and sentences. And don't misunderstand me, that's an important part of reading, and you can't be a successful reader if you cannot do that. However, that is more of a building block to our ultimate goal being comprehending what we read. Generally speaking, comprehension is a process. It starts with understanding individual words, and then the relationships between those words make coherent sentences, relationships between sentences make sensible paragraphs, and relationships between paragraphs make a larger text that we can understand and draw meaning from, and so on. Take a chapter book. The chapters also need to relate to each other and build on each other to reach some thematic goal or informational goal. Series of texts. Each entry in a series will hang together in some way, add to an overall meaning of a text as a whole. So there's a lot that goes into comprehending at deep levels. And in this module, we're not going to be focusing on decoding. We're not going to look at phonics in depth because we have already taken a look at that. And instead, we're going to turn our attention to comprehension strategies, that repertoire of things that we can do as we read to make sure that we are pushing ourselves to understand deeply. First, we'll look at one of the ways that teachers can scaffold students' understanding, and then we'll dive into those strategies that have been shown to be successful more often than not. So we advise the use of the gradual release of responsibility model. This is a model you're probably familiar with, and we certainly use it not only in schools, but with children all the time when we're teaching them. Take, for example, teaching a child how to ride a bike. At first, you are the person completely in control. You are riding the bike, they might be watching you, they could be on a seat on your bike that you've installed for them, but they don't actually contribute to the balancing, the pushing of the pedals, any of the turning. You're still completely in control. Then you move on and give them a little bit more power. Now they're controlling the steering on their own, but you have installed training wheels. You have put something there to support them continuously as they try to ride. Going a little farther from that, you take those training wheels off. Now they are responsible for the steering, they're responsible for their own balance. However, you're still right there beside them. You still have a hand out just in case they need it, and if they don't, you let them keep going into the very final stage, which is being an independent rider. Now, what does this mean when we look at how we teach reading? Well, when we're looking at it from the perspective of teaching reading, we're going to use the same sort of model. We're going to want to start off, and here in this model, we are using this side right over here, this side here. This is the teacher side. This side over here will be the student side. And you'll notice at first, starting with the direct instruction, the teacher has the lion's share of the responsibility. And what this looks like in the classroom, from a teacher perspective, is I do. As a teacher, I am doing. As a student, that student is watching. They're watching what I do to see how it works. By watching, that could also mean listening. That could also mean any other sort of passive perception that they're doing. In the second level down, we're doing something guided. We're doing it together, but we're doing what I as a teacher want us to do, and we're doing it the way that I want us to do it. I still have the majority of the control. Below that, we have collaborative work. We're still working together, but you'll notice we've moved from me instructing to us doing work. We're doing the work that the student wants to do. We're doing it the way they do it. So I'm still there as a teacher to guide them. I'm still there to support them, but they're in the driver's seat until finally they're able to do independent work where I might be watching it, but they're the ones who are doing it. And that's what it looks like from a reading perspective. So, what does it mean to comprehend the written word. It's not describing it as a process isn't perfect, as so many things are not perfect. However, in a simplified process format, you start off with the meaning of individual words. And once you understand the individual words, which we talked about in the vocabulary section, there's a lot to that. But once you can do that, then you start looking at the relationship between those words to make a coherent sentence. How are all these words lined up to make a meaning together? They all relate to each other. Once we understand that sentence level, we start relating sentences in a paragraph to each other so that we can make a larger text. If there are paragraphs, we relate those to each other. If we've gotten up to the point where we have chapters, we see how chapters relate to each other and within each other. If it's a series of texts, so for example, the Magic Tree House has several series, their relatedness to each other is limited. Other series have a lot more relatedness, like the Amulet series of graphic novels. You can't really understand the story without starting at the beginning, whereas Magic Tree House you could sort of pull anywhere, so that's a less connected series. But there are still understandings we build across time as we relate all of these aspects of text to understand the meaning of it as a whole. Now, when we start to actually try and teach this process, obviously the meaning of words, that's the first step, right? You can't understand the meaning of words unless you can understand vocabulary, and we talked about how learning new vocabulary is really built upon decoding skills. Phonics in particular, there could also be whole language aspects to that, sight words in the reading, but until you can do that part, it's really difficult to comprehend a text as a whole. Not impossible, obviously, they're just a barrier. The fewer words you understand, the bigger the barrier to understanding what's going on in the text as a whole, because that foundational piece is missing. Once you do understand those things, though, it's time to start learning comprehension strategies. And your role will be to teach them a repertoire of these active things that good readers do. Again, this is not a hierarchy. This is not a process at this point. These are not one better than the other or one before another. Now, they're related to each other for sure, but we're not talking about how you should use these in series or anything like that. They should be used flexibly and in relation to each other as makes sense as you read. This is what good readers do naturally and what you need to help your readers do as they move forward. So let's go on. We're going to take these one by one. First, monitoring comprehension. This is just what it says. It's understanding when you don't understand. We talked about this a little bit at the vocabulary level, knowing when you don't understand what a word means. And then this is just stepping it up that little bit more. Noticing, oh, I don't know that I understand what I just read. So you need to encourage students to notice that explicitly, notice whether the decoded word makes sense, whether the relationships between the words make sense, and when there's a problem that's detected, you need to have your readers be ready to employ some sort of fix-up strategy, something to happen for them after they've monitored their comprehension, but it's all part of that strategy. This could be rereading the text to clarify. Possibly they just misread something. They could read ahead to see if that would help clarify it. For example, in nonfiction text, quite frequently, there will be a word, a newer word that's introduced, and you might not understand it, but the very next sentence could explain the word that was just used. It's pretty common. They should use all their vocabulary strategies to sort of suss out what unfamiliar words mean, and if they can't figure that out on their own, reach out to other readers, reach out to teachers, reach out to peers, reach out to parents, reach out to other readers who might be able to help them. There's more strategies than that, but that's a good starting place. So once you employed that fix-up strategy, you recheck your reading and you recheck your comprehension. Do I understand what I read now? And until you understand it, you shouldn't move forward, or you should at least be aware as you move forward that there's still a piece you don't understand that you need to go back to. Next up is making connections. So this is both very simple and very complex. It's really easy to make a connection to a text, right? You're going to encourage your students to think about their prior personal experience. That can also be called schema in some of the readings you might do, or background knowledge in some of the other readings you might do. And it encompasses a lot of different types. Can they connect to something in the text that they have read before? or viewed or heard? Can they connect it to something they already know about the world in general, something they know about themselves? Essentially, they need to be able to identify these connections, but that means nothing if those connections aren't helping them understand what they read. And that's the part where this can be harder than it seems. It's not enough to make a connection. If the connection doesn't help you understand the text, it's just a distraction. So you need to merge what you knew about the world, about other texts, about yourself before, to what you've connected to create deeper understanding of the text. That's what makes this a comprehension strategy. Just noticing that some things are similar is not enough. You need to do the next step to deepen your understanding of what you're reading. Asking questions. Once again, and you'll probably hear it for most of these, if it isn't strategic question asking, if it isn't targeting the sorts of thinking that will allow you to understand the text more, then it can become a distraction. But asking questions before, during, and after reading makes it more likely that readers will both remember what they have read and understand it at a deeper level. Asking questions will come naturally to your students. The average kindergartner can probably ask 100 questions to you before lunch. But remember what I said about less experienced readers getting bogged down in the decoding. They need to be reminded to ask these questions. There's a tendency for students, for all readers really, to take what we read at face value. And when we become readers who question what we read, we are prepared to construct deeper and more nuanced meanings. So here's some sorts of questions that you might have readers ready to ask. What did the author mean? Why did they write what they wrote the way they did? Does it make sense? That's a question. It also is monitoring comprehension. Remember, these are related to each other. Does the information sound right, considering what I already know about the world? That's making connections, right? But it's also question asking. In informational text, questions could center on finding information to answer a larger purpose, and we're going to get into that more in the determining importance section, which is a strategy that we'll get to. But again, these are all related to each other, so don't think of them as isolation. Think about them as strategies that all flexibly work together. Once you monitor your comprehension and it breaks down, asking a question about why it broke down could be a good start to understanding and fixing it up. But then there's also the questions about why authors do what they do, authorial intent, and that sort of thing that can be very helpful for readers to think more deeply about the text that they are engaging with. Visualizing. So this is creating a mental image based on what you're reading. And although we call this visualizing, please don't feel limited to just the visual spectrum. It should include all your senses. So imagine the sounds that are being described. Imagine the smells, the tastes. Create a full make-believe experience of the text. This will likely involve making connections to background knowledge. It could involve asking yourself questions about what something would look like, smell like, or feel like. But when you do this, it's not about creating a perfect mental image. And here's what I mean by perfect mental image. There is no one perfect way to think about what an author has described. So there's not just one right answer when you're visualizing. Think about all of the people who read the Harry Potter novels before they saw the movie and then were surprised by choices. And you could say that about any adaptation, any movie that has been made based on a book. There's going to be differences in how you as a reader imagined it and how a director conceived of and shot it and how actors performed it. And that's okay. There are, I hate to say it, but I can't think of a better way to say it, there are wrong ways. So you can't read the color red and then imagine something being blue. Then you've constructed an image that is preventing you from fully understanding the text the way it was written. I have also had examples where the reader was encountering a text that talked about how school was a very happy place. So they visualized being at the beach. When I asked them why they visualized being at the beach, they talked about how it was their happy place. If they've made a connection, they've created a visual, but is that helping them better understand the text? It's a bit of a toss-up. It might depend. If they're understanding the feeling of being happy in a location, Yes, if they're building an image that will accurately depict what the characters are doing in the book so that they can remember it later, maybe not. So that's what visualizing is. Inferring unstated meaning. I've said before not to view these as hierarchical, and you shouldn't, but in practice, inferring and the one we're about to deal with next, determining importance, these are the two that readers probably will struggle with the most. Inferring involves taking the meaning you get from the text, combining it with connections you've made, and then creating an understanding that is not directly stated in the text. For example, let's say the author writes down, "Mom set the cake on the table in front of Sarah. 3 little flames seemed to dance as we sang to her." Nowhere in that text did the author explicitly state what is going on, but I guess you're making some inferences. I suspect you suspect that it's Sarah's birthday, and she's probably turning 3. Most likely, Sarah is a sibling of the narrator. Now, how did I get to all of that? I'm inferring. In my experience, cakes with candles mean birthdays. The number of candles, that means how old the person is. Now I'm stretching a little bit more, but if a woman is setting the cake down, probably the mom of the person having the birthday. Not always, but the narrator called that person who set the cake down mom also. So I expect that the person who is narrating and the person who is having the birthday are siblings. So I would guess that Sarah is the sister of our narrator. So I did a lot there, but it didn't take much, and it's something many readers do naturally. However, less skilled readers will not do that naturally. And so if you ask them questions that require them to infer, to understand something that isn't stated directly in the text, but is very directly connected to the clues and the context of what's occurring, they may or may not understand and then become frustrated as they look through the text for an answer. So you should be able to infer meaning, possibly of unfamiliar words, vocabulary strategy. You should be able to predict what characters would do, how they might feel, what the results of the events in the text would be. I want to caution you, though, when talking about predictions and inferring in the same breath. Predicting is a type of inferring, but it is not the only type, and like so many of our strategies, predicting is only helpful if it's deepening our understanding of the text. Asking students to make a prediction is relatively easy. They'll guess what will happen. Making them ground those guesses in the textual evidence that they see is a little bit trickier, and that's the key. It has to be grounded in the text. It has to be reasonable, if that makes sense. So that's inferring unstated meaning, and on to our last one, and possibly the most difficult, and one that I hope you have a chance to spend some time on. Determining importance. Not everything in a text is important. This is something that inexperienced readers often miss. They assume that because an author wrote something down, it must be important. In very general terms, simplifying things considerably, the things that we notice in a text can be put into 2 different categories: interesting details and important details. There could also be like a Venn diagram with like interesting details and important details, and then in the middle you have interesting details that are also important. It's getting a little complicated, so for the most part, let's just say that there are interesting details and there are important details. But what is the difference? How do we do that sorting? How do we know which ideas are important and which ones are just interesting? It is our purpose as readers. The author will also have a purpose when writing, so certain ideas we might notice are important to the author. For example, the author might help us out by bolding them, by putting them in headers, by repeating them to let us know that they're really important, possibly by putting it into a diagram, again, showing us how important it is by the way that they've emphasized it. But just because the author thought it was important doesn't mean it's the most important things to us. Our purpose is the driving factor here. If our purpose differs from the author's purpose, then what they think is important may or may not align to what we think is important. So being able to distinguish between the author's purpose and the reader's purpose is a really important aspect of this strategy. Important details must be essential to understanding the text in a way that aligns with our purpose. So let's take a look at this example I have up here. Going to a baseball game. Which 3 items are the most important? So I'm going to a baseball game and I'm going to need my team shirt for sure. I'm going to need that team shirt. I definitely want some popcorn because I get hungry. Also, I'm going to take my mitt with me. Those are going to be my 3 most important items because every now and then there's a foul ball and I want to be ready to catch it. Okay, so now I'm going to erase those. And let's say that we're playing a baseball game. Same items, nothing's changed, environment is the same, I'm still going to a stadium, but all of a sudden I have some really different priorities. I need my bat, I need my mitt, and I need my team shirt. Let's say those are my 3. I'll assume that there's a baseball there. If I could pick a 4th one, it would probably be the baseball. Popcorn becomes completely unimportant at that stage. So you see how purpose drives importance. Hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, as always with any of these, if you've had any questions, please contact us so we can help you as soon as possible. All right, next up, you're going to need to complete the 2 required readings, one of which is Chapter 3 in our textbook, Comprehension at the Core, Building Knowledge Through Thinking Intensive Reading. That's going to be in Strategies That Work. Then you're going to have an article, Everything a Teacher Needs to Know About Comprehension. Make sure you get those 2 readings done. Then you need to make sure you contribute to the discussion board. You're going to be thinking about your literature circles, the books that you're going to be reading, and you're going to be planning when you can meet as a group on Zoom to hold the actual discussion. So that will involve making sure you're planning how long it will take you to read your text. There are limits. You need to be doing this by October. Make sure that you have a plan in place. And once you've done that, go ahead and take the quiz for the first part of Module 3 and then move on to Part 2. Thanks, guys.